The rain fell mercilessly, turning the city into a blur of gray and silver. Adrian sat behind the wheel of his luxury car, tapping his fingers against the leather. The traffic light glowed red, but his mind was elsewhere. Boardroom meetings, million-dollar deals, the calculated world he had built for himself. And then he saw her. At first, she was just another figure on the crowded sidewalk, soaking wet, clutching two trembling children. But something about her made his pulse falter. His sharp eyes, trained to scan numbers and detect business opportunities, now locked onto something that had nothing to do with profit. A face, familiar, faint, yet unforgettable. His grip on the wheel tightened. His breath hitched. It could not be her. But as the wind blew, pushing aside the tangled mess of her wet hair, his world tilted. His chest clenched with a force he had not felt in years. It was her, Isla, the woman who had vanished from his life like a shadow in the night, the woman he had once loved beyond reason, only to wake up one day and find her gone. No explanation, no goodbye, just emptiness. Now, she stood before him in rags, with two children pressed against her legs. Homeless, helpless, broken. The light turned green. The impatient honking of cars jolted him, but Adrian did not move. Could not. He just sat there, staring, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Where had she been? Why was she like this? And those children, were they hers? Something inside him snapped. Without a second thought, he swerved his car to the side, ignoring the angry shouts of drivers behind him. Rain soaked through his expensive suit as he stepped out, but he did not care. His feet moved before his mind could catch up, and then her eyes lifted. For a fleeting moment, time stopped. Shock flickered across her face, then fear, as if she had seen a ghost. Adrian took a step forward. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper against the storm. "Isla?" She gripped the children tighter, her lips parting, but no words came out. Adrian knew. He did not know how, but he knew. Something was wrong, something big, and whatever it was about to change everything. Isla took a step back, her grip tightening on the tiny hands clutching hers. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable, raw, desperate. But she was not the only one frozen in the moment. Adrian felt his pulse hammering in his ears, his mind reeling with questions that had no answers. The rain poured harder, drenching them both, yet neither moved. "Isla," he said again, this time firmer. He needed to hear her voice, to know this was real and not some cruel trick of his imagination. But she shook her head, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something he could not yet see. The two children clung to her, their big frightened eyes staring up at him. "Mommy," the little girl whimpered. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. "Mommy?" The word echoed in his mind, slamming into him like a storm. His gaze dropped to the children, a boy and a girl, no older than 4 or 5. Their delicate features, their dark eyes, something about them made his stomach twist. A sickening thought crept into his mind, but he shoved it away. Number? It could not be. It was impossible. "Isla, talk to me," he demanded, his voice laced with something even he could not define. Anger? Pain? Desperation? She flinched, taking another step back, but there was nowhere to run. The sidewalk was packed with pedestrians, some casting curious glances at the soaked millionaire and the beggar woman he refused to let out of his sight. Adrian took a slow step forward, lowering his voice. "Where have you been all these years? What happened to you?" Her lips parted, and for a second he thought she might answer. But then her expression hardened. The woman he had once known, the one who had loved him, who had whispered his name in the dead of night, was gone. "You should not be here," she finally spoke, her voice barely audible over the rain. Adrian frowned. "What do you mean?" "Isla, please, just go." She cut him off, her voice cracking. "Forget you saw me." His chest tightened. Forget? As if he could, as if he had ever been able to. The little boy clung to her dress, his innocent eyes flickering between them. And in that moment, Adrian saw it, a flash of something so familiar, so undeniable, that his entire world came crashing down. His knees almost buckled. His breath came in sharp, ragged pulls. Number. He looked at the boy, then at Isla, then back again. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. "Isla, are they mine?" The world around them faded into nothing. The rain, the honking cars, the curious glances of strangers. None of it mattered. Only Isla, standing before him, frozen. Only the children, clutching at her as if she were the only thing keeping them safe. And only the question that had just left his lips, slicing through the space between them like a blade. "Are they mine?" Isla's breath hitched, and for a moment he saw something flicker in her eyes. Guilt, fear, pain. But she said nothing. Silence stretched between them, unbearable, suffocating. Adrian's heart pounded so loudly he could hear it over the rain. "Answer me!" His voice was sharper than he intended, but he could not control it. His entire world was tilting, slipping through his fingers. Isla's fingers trembled as she held on to the children, as if his question alone could rip them away from her. "It does not matter," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian let out a sharp breath, his jaw tightening. "It does not matter?" He took a step closer, his wet shoes splashing into a puddle. "You disappear for years. No word, no explanation. And now I find you like this, with two children who—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. His throat felt raw, his chest tight. "I need to know the truth, Isla," he said, quieter now, but no less intense. "Are they mine?" Isla's eyes filled with something unreadable. Her lips parted, just for a second, before she pressed them into a thin line. And then she did the one thing Adrian never expected. She turned and ran. Dragging the children with her, Isla darted into the crowd, her soaked dress clinging to her frail body. The children struggled to keep up, their tiny feet stumbling against the wet pavement. Adrian cursed under his breath. Number not this time. Without a second thought, he sprinted after them. He did not know what had happened to Isla all those years ago. He did not know why she had disappeared, why she looked so broken, or why she had lied to him. But he would find out, and nothing would stop him. Adrian pushed through the crowd, his heart pounding as he chased after Isla. The rain blurred his vision, but he did not care. She was slipping away, again, and this time he refused to let her go. "Isla, stop!" he called out, his voice cutting through the chaos of the street. But she did not turn back. Her small frame weaved through the pedestrians, clutching the hands of the two children struggling to keep up. Their tiny feet stumbled on the slick pavement, and for a moment Adrian thought she might let go of them just to escape faster. And then it happened. The little girl tripped. A sharp cry tore through the air as the child fell onto the cold, wet sidewalk. Isla gasped, instantly stopping to scoop her up. But that single moment of hesitation was all Adrian needed. Within seconds he was there, grabbing Isla's wrist before she could run again. "Enough," he growled, his grip firm but not rough. Isla stiffened, her breathing ragged. The little girl whimpered in her arms, while the boy clung to her dress, his big eyes darting between them. Adrian's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his mind racing. Up close, he could see it. The exhaustion in her face, the way her once bright eyes were now filled with something broken. She was thinner than he remembered, her cheekbones sharper, her lips cracked from the cold. This was not the Isla he had known. This was a woman who had suffered. He loosened his grip slightly. "Stop running," he said, his voice quieter now. "Just talk to me." Tears welled in her eyes, mixing with the raindrops on her face. "Please, Adrian," she whispered, "let me go." But Adrian shook his head, his jaw tightening. Not this time. He glanced down at the children. The little girl was crying softly, and something in Adrian's chest twisted painfully. He knelt down, his expensive suit now soaked and ruined, but he did not care. His gaze met the little girl's, and in that moment he felt something strange, something deep. He looked back up at Isla. His voice was almost a whisper now, but the weight of his words was undeniable. "Are they mine?" Isla's lips trembled. Her whole body shook. And then, with a look that shattered him completely, she whispered 4 words that changed everything. "Yes, they are yours." Adrian felt the ground shift beneath him. The rain, the city, the noise, everything faded into the background. They were his, and she had kept them from him. His hands curled into fists, emotions crashing into him all at once. Anger, disbelief, sorrow, but more than anything, one question burned in his mind. "Why?" Adrian stared at her, his entire body frozen. The words echoed in his mind, louder than the rain, louder than the chaotic city around them. Yes, they are yours, his children. She had taken his children from him. His breath came in sharp, uneven pulls as emotions surged through him. Rage, betrayal, disbelief. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to know why. Why she had left, why she had kept this from him, why she had let him believe she was gone forever. His voice was low, shaking with barely controlled fury. "You hid them from me?" Isla flinched as if his words had struck her, her fingers tightening around the little girl's small frame. "Adrian, No!" His voice was sharp, cutting through the air. "You do not get to explain this away, Isla. You disappeared. I searched for you. I mourned you. And all this time you were alive, raising my children on the streets." Tears streamed down Isla's face now, but Adrian did not know if they were from guilt or something else. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. He turned his gaze to the children. His children. The little girl clung to Isla, her small body shaking. The boy, Adrian's son, stood silent, watching him with wide, unreadable eyes. Something inside Adrian twisted painfully. They were innocent. They had no idea of the storm raging between him and Isla. His fists clenched. "How long, Isla?" His voice was hoarse. "How long have you been living like this?" Isla swallowed hard. Since they were born." Adrian felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. 5 years. 5 years his children had been out in the cold, struggling. 5 years Isla had chosen to keep them away from him. 5 years he could never get back. A sharp wave of fury and heartbreak crashed over him. He wanted to lash out, to demand why she had done this to him, to them. But then Isla did something that stopped him cold. She took a step closer, her voice shaking. "I did not leave because I wanted to, Adrian." Her lip trembled. I left because I had to. Adrian's jaw tightened. What does that mean? She looked around frantically as if afraid someone was watching. Then her next words came out in a whisper, filled with something dark, something terrifying. Because if I had stayed, all three of us would be dead. Adrian's blood ran cold. What had she been running from? Adrian felt the world tilt. His breath caught in his throat as Isla's words echoed in his mind. If I had stayed, all three of us would be dead. His body tensed. The anger that had been raging inside him only moments ago was now replaced with something far worse. Fear. He took a slow step closer, lowering his voice. Isla, what do you mean? She shook her head quickly, her eyes darting around like she expected someone to jump out of the shadows. Not here, she whispered. Please, Adrian, I cannot talk about this here. Adrian clenched his jaw. He could see the fear in her, the way she held the children close, her body a fragile shield between them and the world. She was terrified, not of him, but of something else. He took a steadying breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Fine, he said, his voice firm. Then come with me. Her head snapped up. What? Come with me, he repeated. To my home. You and the children. Isla's hands tightened around her daughter's small frame. No, I cannot. You can, Adrian said, his tone unyielding. And you will. You think I'm just going to walk away now, after finding you like this, after finding out I have children? His gaze softened for a brief second. I do not know what happened, Isla, but whatever it is, you do not have to do this alone anymore. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. Adrian, you do not understand. If they find out I am alive— Who? Adrian demanded. Who are you running from? She swallowed hard, but before she could answer, the little girl in her arms whimpered, shivering against her. Isla looked down at her daughter, brushing wet strands of hair from her tiny face. The boy was silent, but his small fingers clung tightly to Isla's dress, his wide eyes filled with something Adrian could only describe as exhaustion. His heart twisted painfully. They were cold, they were scared, and they were his. Enough, Adrian said, more gently this time. Come with me, Isla. If you will not do it for yourself, do it for them. Isla's lips trembled as she looked at her children. A war was raging inside her. Adrian could see it. Fear, hesitation, but also something else. Hope. Finally, after what felt like forever, she gave a shaky nod. Adrian released the breath he had been holding. I will get us a car. Isla clutched her children close as Adrian pulled out his phone, calling for his driver. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. Who had forced Isla to run? Who had threatened her life? And, most importantly, what kind of danger was still lurking in the shadows? The black luxury car pulled up to the curb, its sleek design standing in stark contrast to the rain-soaked streets. Adrian did not wait for the driver to step out. He opened the door himself, his patience stretched thin. He turned back to Isla, who stood frozen, gripping her children's hands as if stepping into that car meant surrendering everything. Get in, Adrian said, his voice firm but not unkind. She hesitated. Her eyes darted around the street once more, scanning the faces of strangers, the passing headlights, the dark corners of the city. Adrian followed her gaze, his instincts sharpening. She was not just scared, she was hunted. His jaw clenched. Enough of this. He took a step toward her and, in a swift motion, reached down and scooped the little girl into his arms. She let out a tiny gasp, but instead of pulling away, she curled against his chest, her tiny fingers gripping his suit. his heart clenched. "Adrian," Isla gasped, her body tensing. "You do not have a choice," he interrupted, his voice low. "I do not care what reasons you had for running, Isla. You and these children are coming with me. Now." Isla looked at her son, who was staring at Adrian with wide, silent eyes. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, she nodded. Adrian opened the door wider, and Isla slid inside with her son. He followed, keeping the little girl close. The car door shut, sealing them in. A deep silence filled the space, interrupted only by the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows. Adrian turned to Isla, who sat stiffly, her arms wrapped protectively around her son. The interior of the car was warm, but she still looked like she was freezing. Her wet dress clung to her fragile frame, and for the first time, Adrian noticed just how thin she had become. His chest tightened. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Where to, sir?" Adrian's gaze never left Isla's face. "Home." As the car pulled away from the curb, Isla closed her eyes for a brief second, as if gathering the strength to face whatever came next. Adrian could see it, the battle raging inside her, the fear, the exhaustion, and something else buried deep beneath it all. Relief. She was safe. For now. But Adrian knew one thing for certain. Whatever she had been running from was not gone, and he was going to find out exactly who had stolen 5 years of his life. The car moved smoothly through the city, its interior silent except for the soft breaths of the children. Adrian held the little girl against his chest, feeling the slight rise and fall of her breathing as she slowly drifted off to sleep. Her small fingers clutched his shirt, as if she instinctively knew she was safe. His gaze shifted to Isla. She sat stiff and tense, staring out the window as if expecting the world to rip her away at any moment. The dim city lights reflected in her tired eyes, and Adrian could see the weight of years pressing down on her. "Who is after you, Isla?" he finally asked, his voice low but firm. She did not look at him. "It does not matter." Adrian exhaled sharply, his frustration building. "It does matter. You left me. You took my children. And now I find you begging on the streets, terrified of something you refuse to name. Do you think I will just ignore this?" She turned to him then, her eyes filled with something raw. "I had no choice, Adrian." Her voice cracked. "I did what I had to do to keep them alive." His grip on the sleeping child tightened. "From who, Isla?" She hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. Then, in barely more than a whisper, she said, "Your father." Adrian went completely still. His father. His blood ran cold. "That is impossible," he said, his voice eerily calm. "My father has been dead for 3 years." Isla gave a hollow laugh. "And yet, I am still running." Adrian's hands clenched into fists. He had always known his father was a ruthless businessman, a man who saw emotions as weaknesses and love as a distraction. But what could he have done to Isla that would make her flee this way? "Tell me everything," Adrian demanded, his voice hard. Isla looked away. "Not now. Not here." His jaw tightened, but he let it go. For now, she was breaking right in front of him, and pushing harder would only make her retreat. Instead, he glanced down at the little girl still nestled against him. His daughter. A child he had never even known existed. The realization crashed into him all over again, leaving him breathless. He had missed their first steps, their first words, their first everything, and all because of his father. Adrian forced himself to stay composed. Isla was safe now. Their children were safe. But whatever dark secrets she had been carrying, whatever ghosts still haunted her, he was going to uncover them, and when he did, someone was going to pay. The car finally pulled up to the mansion, its tower and gates looming ahead. Adrian stepped out first, careful not to disturb the little girl still nestled in his arms. The mansion was quiet, a silent testament to the life Adrian had built, one filled with wealth, power, and isolation. But in that moment, as he looked at Isla, with her broken eyes and guarded heart, he realized how empty it all seemed. "Come inside," he said, his voice softer now, guiding her toward the door. Isla hesitated again, her gaze flickering to the grand house behind him. She was clearly out of place here, in this world of marble floors and glistening chandeliers. Her ragged dress, soaked from the rain, clung to her like a constant reminder of the life she had escaped. As they stepped inside, the warmth of the mansion embraced them. Adrian glanced back to see the children shivering, their small faces pale with exhaustion. "Upstairs," he instructed the housekeeper who had appeared in the foyer. "Give them some blankets and dry clothes. They are to be treated with the same respect as any guest here." The housekeeper nodded quickly, taking the children in her arms. Adrian watched for a moment, his chest tightening as he realized how much had been taken from him in these 5 years. Once they were alone, Adrian turned to Isla. She had sunk into the plush couch, her head in her hands, her body trembling. The last remnants of the storm outside raged, but inside it was peaceful. Too peaceful, almost. "You can rest," he said, walking toward her. "But we need to talk. You owe me that much." Isla looked up at him, her eyes bloodshot. "Adrian, why didn't you tell me about them?" His voice was hoarse, strained. "Why didn't you come to me when you found out you were pregnant? I would have helped you. I would have taken care of you." Her lips trembled. "You don't understand. It wasn't just about me. It was about keeping them safe, about protecting them from everything I couldn't protect you from." Adrian's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? You're talking in riddles." Isla stood abruptly, her hands shaking as she gripped the back of the couch. "I'm talking about your father, Adrian. Your father did this to us. He killed the only man who tried to protect me, and after that, there was nowhere to go. I had no choice but to disappear, or we would have all ended up in the ground." Adrian took a step back, as if her words had slapped him. His father? But his father had been dead for years, hadn't he? Everything inside him began to crack open. The pain, the betrayal, the confusion. This was more than he could have ever imagined. "Tell me everything," he demanded again, his voice breaking. "Tell me how deep this goes, because whatever it is, we are not running anymore. You are safe here, and if I have to, I will burn the world down to protect my family." Isla's eyes met his, and for the first time, she let her guard down completely. Her shoulders slumped, her hands falling to her sides. "You think I've been hiding from you, Adrian? From your father? You have no idea what kind of monster he was, or still is." Adrian's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" And then, with the weight of years of fear and silence, Isla finally spoke the words that would change everything. "Your father isn't dead, Adrian. He's alive, and he has been hunting me ever since I ran." Adrian froze, his entire body going still. The words Isla had spoken hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating fog. "Your father isn't dead. He's alive." His mind raced, unable to fully comprehend what she had just revealed. It felt like the ground beneath him had cracked open, the foundation of everything he had ever known beginning to crumble. How could this be? His father, the man who had raised him, who had built an empire, was alive. How could he have been so wrong about the one person he thought he understood more than anyone else? Isla stood in front of him, her eyes red and swollen, her body trembling as if the truth had physically broken her. "I know this is hard to believe, Adrian, but I swear on my life, your father is alive. He faked his death, staged everything, and kept me in hiding because of what we know." Adrian shook his head, unable to grasp the magnitude of her words. But why? Why would he do that? What could you possibly know that would make him do something like this? Isla took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "It's not just about me, Adrian. It's about them, about your children. He had me followed for months after I left. When I found out I was pregnant, he wanted to use them, manipulate them for his own gain." She swallowed hard. He knew that if he could control you through your children, he could have you just where he wanted you. And I couldn't let that happen. I had to keep them safe from him at any cost. Adrian felt a knot form in his stomach. The thought of his father, the man who had taught him everything, the man who had been his idol, turning out to be a cold, calculating monster was almost too much to bear. "I don't believe you," he said, though his voice was shaky, as if the words had no power behind them. "This has to be a lie. My father wouldn't do something like that." Isla's eyes softened, and she stepped closer, her voice gentle but filled with years of pain. "I wish it were a lie. I wish I could tell you that you're wrong. But you know deep down, Adrian, that your father would never do anything unless it benefited him. And this was his ultimate game, to control you, to make you into a puppet on his strings." Adrian's head spun. His father, alive. And now there was no escaping him. "I thought I was done with him," Adrian muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I thought his death had ended everything. But now it's just beginning," Isla said, her voice hard. "And if you don't stop him, if you don't find out where he's hiding, he will come for you, for your children." Adrian took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been so focused on the past, the betrayal, the heartbreak, but now he realized the stakes were much higher. He wasn't just fighting for his own peace anymore. He was fighting for his family, for the future of his children. With a fire burning in his chest, Adrian turned toward the door. "We're going to end this, once and for all." Isla caught his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Adrian, you cannot do this alone." He looked at her, his expression hardening. "I never intended to." The war was just beginning, and Adrian was ready to face it head on. Whatever his father had planned, it would be nothing compared to the rage that now burned in his veins. Isla was no longer just a woman from his past. She was the mother of his children, and nothing, not even his father, would take her or them away from him again. With a final glance at the sleeping children, Adrian made his decision. This was the end of the game, the end of the lies, and he would stop at nothing to make sure his family was safe. His father had made the biggest mistake of his life, and now Adrian would make him pay.